Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the Blood Led to Confession, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K., Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown's Deadly Confession Unveiled. The words Father Brown spoke shattered everything. The killer is standing in this room, and it's not who you think. Silence hung in the air like a thick fog. Everyone turned to look at him, unable to fathom what he had just revealed. How could he be so sure? How could he make such a claim? The tension was suffocating, and no one dared speak as Father Brown stood at the center of the room, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in their minds. It was supposed to be an ordinary case. A wealthy merchant was dead, his body found in a locked study, a pool of blood staining the Persian rug beneath him. The police had their suspicions, but the truth seemed just out of reach, like a shadow slipping through their grasp. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no motive. The mystery seemed impossible to solve. But Father Brown, with his quiet wisdom and ability to see the truth behind the mask of appearances, had been called in. When he arrived at the estate, he felt it. Something was off. The house was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. The servants moved like ghosts, their eyes avoiding his as if they knew something they weren't willing to share. The family was equally tense, their eyes darting nervously whenever Father Brown entered a room. The whole atmosphere felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. Father Brown's mind raced as he pieced together the evidence. The merchant had been well liked, respected in the community, and yet someone had wanted him dead. The will, locked away in his study, was missing, and that alone raised red flags. But that wasn't the only thing that troubled Father Brown. It was the look in the eyes of the family members when they spoke of the deceased. There was something more beneath the surface, something dark, something they weren't saying. As Father Brown examined the room where the body was found, he noticed a faint smudge of blood on the desk, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He traced the line with his finger, his mind working overtime. It didn't match the pattern of the rest of the blood spatter. It was a clue, but it wasn't enough. Something was missing. Then a voice broke the stillness. It was one of the servants, trembling as she entered the room. "Father, there's something you need to see," she said, holding out a small, blood-stained piece of cloth. The cloth was a dark shade of red, and as Father Brown held it in his hand, he felt a chill run down his spine. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The servant glanced around nervously, then whispered, "It was in the garden, near the back door. I saw someone leave it there, but I wasn't sure who. It looked like someone was hiding it." Father Brown's mind whirled. A hidden clue, a piece of evidence no one else had noticed. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, but it only deepened the mystery. Why would someone hide this piece of cloth, and why was it stained with blood? Father Brown's instincts told him that this was just the tip of the iceberg, but even he couldn't have prepared for what would come next. As he continued to investigate, he uncovered more details that sent his mind spiraling into doubt. The family members who had seemed so innocent were now under scrutiny. Each one of them had secrets, secrets they weren't ready to reveal. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more questions arose. Everyone had a reason to be suspicious, but no one seemed guilty. Then came the first big revelation. Father Brown sat in the parlor. The family members gathered around him, waiting for his analysis. He had discovered something so startling, it left everyone speechless. The will, he began slowly, wasn't just missing. It was never meant to be found. The merchant had it destroyed before he died. But it wasn't just the will that was hidden. It was the truth behind it. The room fell silent. The will had been destroyed? What did that mean? Father Brown had uncovered a secret so deep, it was as if the entire family was involved in some twisted game of deception. But the truth was even darker than anyone could have imagined. "I know who the killer is," Father Brown continued, his voice steady, yet laced with a tension that none of them had expected. "But the truth is, so much more complicated than you realize. The killer is hiding in plain sight, and no one here is innocent." The family members exchanged looks, their faces paling as Father Brown's words sank in. They had all assumed the investigation was nearing its end, but now it seemed as though it was just beginning. Father Brown wasn't finished yet. He had uncovered something far darker than they could have ever predicted. As the mystery deepened, Father Brown found himself facing not just a case of murder, but a complex web of lies, betrayals, and hidden motives. The deeper he dug, the more impossible it became to untangle the truth. And with each piece of the puzzle he uncovered, the more dangerous the game became. The family members, who had once seemed like nothing more than pawns in a simple case, now seemed like players in a twisted chess game, each with their own hidden agenda. Everyone was guilty of something, but no one seemed to be the killer. Father Brown's mind raced as he searched for the final piece of the puzzle. The tension in the room was unbearable, each second stretching on like an eternity. Finally, just when it seemed like the mystery would never be solved, Father Brown spoke again. "I know who did it," he said, his voice cold and calm. "But the truth will never be told. Not by me, not by anyone." The room erupted in chaos. How could Father Brown know the truth and still refuse to reveal it? What kind of twisted reasoning had led him to this point? The family members were left in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. And just like that, the case was closed. Or so it seemed. As the investigation came to a halt, the questions lingered. Was Father Brown protecting someone, or was he simply too shaken by the dark truths he had uncovered? The mystery of the merchant's death remained unsolved, and no one knew what really happened in that locked study. The room grew cold as Father Brown turned away, his mind still racing. He knew the truth, but some truths were too dangerous to reveal. The killer might have been caught, but the real story was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 2. The blood-stained clue that haunts Father Brown. The blood was still wet, and it had only one message: "I'm not who you think I am." Father Brown stood over the crimson stain, his eyes cold, calculating, yet a flicker of doubt crossed his face. It was as though the universe had just presented him with a riddle so twisted even his keen intellect couldn't wrap itself around it. This was no ordinary clue. It was a confession, yet a lie, a contradiction, and Father Brown knew, deep down, that every second spent contemplating it would make the truth even more elusive. What could it mean? And more importantly, what would it cost him to unravel it? The case had begun innocently enough. A young woman found dead in her lavish home. A single stab wound to her chest. No witnesses, no real clues. Everything seemed simple. A crime of passion, perhaps. The family was shaken, the servants too scared to speak, and the local constable had all but given up. The scene was grim, the victim's life extinguished too soon. And yet Father Brown, always calm, always methodical, sensed something was off. He arrived at the scene, greeted by the family, all of whom seemed to be hiding something. The young woman's father, a wealthy aristocrat, barely able to keep his composure. The mother too composed, her face frozen in sorrow that didn't quite reach her eyes, and the house staff, who looked as though they'd all seen ghosts, murmuring in hushed tones. They all seemed like perfect suspects, but something didn't sit right. The silence in the air felt too heavy, as if the house itself was holding a secret so dark that even the walls were afraid to speak. Father Brown stepped into the parlor where the body was found, his gaze sweeping the room. The victim had been discovered, slumped over on the floor, her eyes wide open in a look of pure terror. The bloodstain around her was unmistakable. Yet, as he knelt beside her, inspecting the scene, it became apparent that this was no ordinary murder. The bloodstain was too precise, too exact. It was like the killer had meticulously arranged it, a work of cruel art. But it wasn't the blood on the floor that caught his attention. It was the tiny scrap of cloth lying just beside the victim. It was a single piece of crimson fabric, faintly stained. But it wasn't blood that had left its mark. It was something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of Father Brown's neck stand on end. He picked it up gently, inspecting it with a careful eye. This was not a random piece of cloth. It had a shape, a cut, an imprint, something personal, something deliberate. Father Brown's mind began to race. Could the cloth be a clue from the killer? A signature, perhaps, something the murderer had left behind on purpose? Or was it a red herring thrown in to mislead him? As he stood up, holding the cloth, a thought gripped him with sudden clarity. This is no accident. This was meant for me to find. Father Brown walked to the victim's father, who was standing by the window, staring out as if trying to avoid the weight of the situation. "What is this?" Father Brown asked, his voice steady, but filled with an unspoken urgency. The aristocrat turned slowly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before he quickly masked it with his usual air of composure. I'm not sure," he stammered, "but that was never in the room." Father Brown stared at him for a moment, his mind working through the possibilities, but the answers seemed to slip through his fingers. The man was hiding something, but what? And why did this cloth seem so familiar? Father Brown stepped outside, the chill of the evening air biting at his skin. He had seen this before, though he couldn't place it. The way people reacted when they were trying to hide the truth. The way a murder scene sometimes whispered secrets that could never be uncovered. His thoughts were interrupted when he was approached by the housekeeper, a woman with a fragile look in her eyes, as if she were more than just a servant. She handed him a letter, trembling. "I found this in her things," she whispered. "I don't know if it means anything, Father, but I thought you should see it." Father Brown unfolded the letter, scanning it quickly. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, yet hurried. But it was the words that made his stomach drop. "I've made a terrible mistake. I've seen what I shouldn't. And now it's too late. I didn't mean to get involved, but they dragged me into this. The truth will come out, but not in time. The letter ended there. Nothing more, nothing less. It was as if someone had been trying to confess, but the words had been cut short, as if the writer had been stopped in their tracks. The blood-stained cloth, the cryptic letter, and the victim's fearful expression, they all pointed to one thing. There was more to this death than met. The eye, much more. Father Brown returned to the study, where the young woman's personal belongings were kept. He examined every detail, every photograph, every letter. But one item stood out, a photograph of the victim with a man whom Father Brown had seen earlier in the house, the man who had been pacing nervously near the back garden. The man's face was filled with urgency, fear, and something else, guilt. Father Brown's instincts screamed that the man was more involved in this than he had let on. But why? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but something was wrong. Something didn't fit. The victim's father had been too distraught, the mother too composed, and the servants too nervous. Everyone had a reason to want her dead, but no one had a clear motive. The layers of deception were so thick that it seemed as though Father Brown might never uncover the truth. And just when it seemed like he was about to reach a breakthrough, a terrible realization dawned on him. What if the answer wasn't as simple as finding the killer? What if the true mystery was about what had been hidden from everyone, what no one was meant to find? Father Brown stood frozen in the middle of the room, the blood-stained cloth still clutched in his hand. His eyes narrowed as he processed everything that had happened. "There's something much darker at play here," he whispered to himself. "I haven't uncovered it all yet." The truth was slipping further and further from his grasp the deeper he delved. The mystery had only just begun, and Father Brown knew that the darkest truths had yet to be revealed. Who could he trust? Who was the real murderer? But before he could answer these questions, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift. Father Brown looked up, his eyes wide with sudden shock. "I know who did it." The room grew eerily silent, the walls closing in on him. The family, the servants, and everyone around him waited with bated breath, the air thick with anticipation. But just as Father Brown was about to speak, the door creaked open, and another figure entered the room, a figure Father Brown had not expected to see. The chilling truth was now more complicated than ever. The final answer remained just out of reach, and for the first time, Father Brown knew the cost of the truth might be more than anyone could bear. He turned to the figure, his voice low but filled with an undeniable certainty. "The truth will never be told." Chapter 3: Father Brown's Hidden Truths Exposed. The truth was staring Father Brown in the face, but what he saw almost made him wish it wasn't there at all. "I know who did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening silence that filled the room. His eyes, usually calm and knowing, now burned with an unsettling fire. "But I can't tell you," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the group of onlookers who had gathered around him. A collective breath was held as they all waited for the answer, only to be struck with the chilling realization that Father Brown, the very man who had uncovered every dark secret they had kept hidden, was now keeping one of his own. The case had started as any other, a murder in a quiet village, a victim found in an isolated cottage, and a family desperately trying to cling to their respectability. The circumstances seemed simple. The victim had been a well-known writer, an old man, beloved by all. He had been found with a single gunshot wound to the head. No struggle, no signs of forced entry. The weapon was missing. The whole thing seemed like a tragic accident or a moment of desperation, but Father Brown knew better. As he arrived at the scene, something felt off. The air was thick with tension, the house too still, like a predator waiting for its prey. Father Brown moved with a quiet assurance, the kind that made him seem almost otherworldly. As he stepped into the writer's study, the first thing he noticed was the way the blood had pooled on the floor, oddly symmetrical, almost as though it had been arranged. But the thing that truly caught his attention wasn't the murder scene. It was the way the family members reacted. The daughter, her face pale and tear-streaked, kept averting her eyes whenever Father Brown glanced at her. The son, whose fists were clenched tightly at his sides, appeared to be holding back some unspeakable fury. And then there was the widow, standing so still by the fireplace, her face a mask of sorrow, but her eyes had a glint of something far darker. Father Brown knew that appearances could be deceiving, and he began his investigation with the one thing that always guided him through the most complex of mysteries, his intuition. His mind worked in quiet flashes, picking up on details that no one else would have noticed. The quiet flicker of the widow's gaze when she thought no one was looking, the way the son's hand trembled when he held his mother's arm. Every clue, every oddity was carefully filed away. But it wasn't until he found something unexpected that the case truly began to unravel. In a hidden drawer beneath the desk, Father Brown found a series of letters, written in the same hand as the victim's own. But there was something wrong. The letters spoke of a secret, one that had been kept from everyone. The victim had known something that would have destroyed the family's reputation, something so terrible that he had decided to write about it in his final days. The last letter was the most chilling of all. "They will never forgive me," it read, "but I can't die with this secret. The truth must come out, even if it costs me everything." The words were jagged, smeared with ink in places, as though the victim had been in a hurry or perhaps in distress. But what was this secret? What had he learned that was so damning? Father Brown knew that finding the answer to that question was the key to solving the murder. He began to piece together the fragments of the victim's life, his connections, his dealings with the family. The truth he was after was slipping further and further from his grasp. Every time he thought he was close, more questions emerged. The victim's daughter had been involved with a man, one who had disappeared just days before the murder. The son had been having secret meetings with someone in town, someone whose identity he refused to reveal. And the widow, who had always been so composed, had been hiding a truth of her own, one so dark it threatened to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. Days passed, and Father Brown's investigation grew more complicated. He uncovered details that made him doubt everything he thought he knew. The family was a web of lies, each member hiding something, each one harboring a secret that could unravel their carefully constructed lives. But the deeper Father Brown dug, the more dangerous the mystery became. He started to see things that weren't there, to hear whispers in the shadows. The case was consuming him, and it was only a matter of time before it drove him to the brink. It was then that he discovered something he never expected: a hidden journal, buried in the floorboards of the writer's study. The journal was old, its pages yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting was unmistakable. The victim had written it in his final days. Father Brown's heart pounded as he flipped through the pages. It was filled with cryptic entries, half-finished thoughts, and disturbing musings on a secret so dangerous that the victim had decided to leave it behind, as if knowing he might never live to tell the full story. One entry stood out above the rest. "I've uncovered the truth, but I can't expose it. Not yet. Not until I know for sure what it means." The words were followed by a date, the day before the victim's death. But what truth had he uncovered, and why was it so important that the victim had to keep it hidden? Father Brown's mind raced. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture was more twisted than he had anticipated. As he stared at the journal, a horrifying thought struck him. What if the truth was so terrible that the victim had to die to protect it? And what if the family, in their desperation, had taken matters into their own hands to ensure that secret remained buried? The first big revelation came when Father Brown confronted the widow. Her face turned pale when he mentioned the letters, the journal, and the hidden truths. Her lips quivered, but she refused to speak. It wasn't until Father Brown pressed her, using every ounce of his psychological acumen, that she broke. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The truth is more dangerous than you think. If you dig any deeper, you'll destroy us all." Father Brown's heart sank as the widow's confession echoed in his ears. She had known about the secret all along, had even helped the victim hide it. But why? And what was so terrible about the truth that it had to be concealed at any cost? The mystery deepened, and with each answer, more questions arose. Father Brown was now tangled in a web of deceit, guilt, and fear. The family was unraveling, their darkest secrets clawing their way to the surface. But the final twist was yet to come. Father Brown had pieced together the story, but there was one detail that he had overlooked, one clue that had remained hidden in plain sight. And it was only when he saw it that the full extent of the mystery was revealed. It was the blood-stained letter, the very letter that had sparked the investigation in the first place. As Father Brown reread it, the true meaning of the victim's last words became clear. The secret had been hidden not because it was dangerous, but because it was too close to home. The victim hadn't just discovered the family's dark past. He had uncovered something that would destroy their future. But the question remained, who would go to such lengths to protect this secret, and why? Father Brown turned to face the family, his eyes burning with the weight of the truth. He knew the answer, but revealing it would tear everything apart. As he stood there, staring at the family members who had once seemed so innocent, he knew that the only way to keep the truth hidden was to walk away. "I know who did it," Father Brown said, his voice low and final. "But the truth will never be told." The room fell into a stunned silence, and for the first time in his life, Father Brown wondered if he had made the right choice. The mystery was solved, but the truth, dark, twisted, and buried, would never be revealed. The cost was too high, and some truths were better left unsaid. As Father Brown walked away from the case, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered the most dangerous secret of all, the one that lay hidden within himself. Chapter 4. The Confession That Shook Father Brown. "It was never about the murder," Father Brown muttered under his breath, his fingers trembling as he held the confession in front of him. The words on the page were seared into his mind, words that no one had expected to hear, not from the person who had said them. The room was suffocating with tension, every eye fixed on Father Brown as if the truth had just been revealed, and now everything they knew was about to be shattered. The confession wasn't just an admission of guilt. It was the opening of a door that none of them were ready to walk through, and Father Brown wasn't sure if he should be the one to open it. The case had seemed like any other, a life taken in a quiet, unassuming village. A young man, found dead under suspicious circumstances, his body dumped in an alley behind a local tavern. The initial signs pointed to a robbery gone wrong. The man had been wealthy, a successful merchant, but his life had been cut short by a single stab wound to the back. It seemed straightforward, a crime of opportunity, but there was something about the way the townsfolk reacted to the murder that troubled Father Brown. The whispers, the looks exchanged behind closed doors, the tension in the air. It was all too thick, too deliberate. From the moment Father Brown arrived in the village, he felt it. There was a weight hanging over the entire town, something no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone knew was there. And as Father Brown began to sift through the layers of deceit, he realized that the victim wasn't the only one hiding something. Everyone was hiding something. The widow, the merchant's son, even the innkeeper, all had secrets, all had motives, but none of them could be the true killer, could they? The more Father Brown investigated, the more tangled the web became, and the less certain he felt about anything. As he pieced together the details, Father Brown's suspicions began to settle on the young man's wife. She had been devastated by her husband's death, or so it seemed. She had been seen weeping openly in the town square, her face streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she clutched her husband's belongings. But Father Brown knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. She had an air of guilt about her, a forced sorrow that didn't quite reach her eyes. And when Father Brown had asked her about the circumstances surrounding her husband's death, her answers had been vague, evasive, as though she were hiding something far darker than grief. Father Brown's gut told him that she was involved somehow, but he couldn't prove it. That was when he stumbled upon something he hadn't expected, a hidden letter. The letter had been tucked away in an old chest in the widow's bedroom, and when Father Brown found it, he knew instantly that it was the key to everything. But as he read it, his heart sank. The words written on the page were far more than he could have ever anticipated. "I know the truth about my husband," the letter began, "and I can't live with it any more. What I did was unforgivable, but I thought I could bury it. I thought it was buried forever." Father Brown's hands shook as he read the rest of the letter. It was a confession, but not for murder. The widow was confessing to something far darker, something that explained her strange behavior, her broken composure. She wasn't mourning the death of her husband. She was mourning the life she had built on lies. The letter went on to reveal a secret affair between the widow and none other than the victim's own brother, the man who had always been the silent shadow in the background of the family. The victim had known about the affair, and he had threatened to expose it, to ruin his brother's reputation and take away everything the widow had worked for. And in a twisted turn of fate, it was that very threat that had led to his death. The widow had convinced her lover to kill her husband, to protect them both. It had been premeditated, a crime of passion, wrapped in deceit. But as Father Brown read on, the real shock came. The widow wasn't the only one hiding something. The confession, dark and twisted as it was, wasn't the full truth. As Father Brown pieced the rest of the letter together, it became clear that the man who had confessed to the crime, her lover, wasn't the true killer. The real murderer was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Father Brown stared at the letter, his mind spinning. He had thought he had solved the case. He had thought he understood the motive, the circumstances. But now, everything had changed. The widow's confession, as damning as it seemed, only raised more questions. Who was the real killer? And why was the widow's lover willing to take the fall for a crime he didn't commit? The darkness in the room seemed to grow, suffocating Father Brown as he sat there, the confession in his hands. He couldn't trust what he had just read. He couldn't even trust what he had believed to be the truth for so long. The more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The real murderer had to be someone close to the widow, someone who knew everything. But who? And why had they allowed the wrong man to take the blame? Father Brown's mind raced. The pieces were scattered. Too many unanswered questions. Too many lies still hanging in the air. He needed to confront the widow, to understand why she would go so far to protect her lover. But as he approached the house, the sense of dread grew heavier. What would she say when he confronted her with the truth? Would she reveal the rest of her secrets, or would she continue to bury them deep, hidden from the world? He knocked on the door, and when it opened, the widow stood there, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. "Father Brown," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You've come for the truth, haven't you?" Father Brown nodded. "I have the confession," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. "But there's more to this than you're telling me." Her eyes flickered with a hint of fear, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "I told you everything," she said, her hands shaking. "I told you about the affair, about the murder. What else is there?" Father Brown stepped forward, the letter still clenched in his hand. "You lied," he said, his voice cold. "You lied in that letter, and I know why." The widow's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as if she was searching for the right words. But Father Brown wasn't waiting for her to explain. He already knew the truth. He had pieced it all together. "The real killer," Father Brown said, his voice low and steady, "is someone who wanted to take everything from you. Someone you trusted. Someone you never suspected." The widow's face drained of color as she slowly sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "Who?" she whispered, barely able to speak the word. Father Brown hesitated, his gaze fixed on her. "Your son," he finally said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Your son killed his father, and he's the one who made sure the blame fell on your lover. He's the one who will do anything to get his hands on the family fortune." The room went still, the air thick with shock and disbelief. The widow's eyes widened, her mouth trembling as the truth crashed over her. Father Brown stood over her, his mind racing. He had uncovered the most twisted of secrets, but the truth, no matter how dark, was finally out. The question now wasn't who had committed the crime, but what would happen when the truth came crashing down on everyone. Father Brown turned and walked toward the door. "I know who did it," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 5. Father Brown's darkest secret revealed. "I've been lying to you all," Father Brown said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words were so quiet, yet they echoed through the room with such force that it felt like the ground beneath their feet had cracked open. A cold shiver ran down the spine of every soul present as they absorbed his confession. "And I think I've made a grave mistake." His eyes, always steady, always certain, now flickered with something far darker. Father Brown, the calm, unshakable priest, had just made a declaration that no one had ever expected. A confession so shocking, so devastating, that it turned everything they thought they knew about him upside down. No one had ever seen Father Brown vulnerable, not like this. It had started, like many of his cases, with a simple request for help. A woman came to him, desperate and afraid, claiming that her husband had been murdered. The police had dismissed it as a suicide, but she knew better. She had seen the signs, and she insisted that the truth was buried somewhere beneath the surface, hidden just out of reach. Father Brown had taken the case, as he always did, with the quiet resolve of a man who had seen it all, who had confronted the worst of humanity and emerged unscathed. But this time, the case would haunt him in ways he could not have foreseen. The woman's husband had been found in his study, his body slumped over the desk, a pistol resting in his hand. A note had been left behind, but it made no sense. The sins of the past must be paid for, it read, the handwriting shaky, as if written by someone on the edge of madness. The police had found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. All the pieces fit together too perfectly for it to be anything other than a suicide. But Father Brown's instincts told him otherwise. There was something wrong here, something more sinister, lurking beneath the surface. As he began to dig deeper, Father Brown uncovered details that sent a chill down his spine. The dead man had a hidden past, a past that no one had spoken of. He had been involved in a secretive, illegal business, one that he had worked hard to bury. But now, as Father Brown connected the dots, it became clear that someone had been willing to kill to keep those secrets hidden. Someone who knew what the victim had done. Someone who feared the truth being exposed. Father Brown's investigation led him to the victim's closest associates. Each one seemed more suspicious than the last, but none of them seemed to have the means or the motive to kill. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more tangled the web became. No one was innocent. Everyone had something to hide, and Father Brown began to suspect that the truth was far darker than he had imagined. But it wasn't until Father Brown spoke with the victim's wife again that the pieces finally started to fall into place. Her story, once filled with grief, now seemed tinged with something else. A carefully constructed narrative designed to conceal the real motive behind her husband's death. It was in this conversation that Father Brown made a discovery that would change everything. The woman who had claimed to be his grieving widow had once been married to someone else, someone who had been involved in the very illegal business that had consumed her husband's life. The past had come rushing back, and Father Brown realized that the sins the victim had been paying for were not his own, but his wife's. It was then that Father Brown uncovered the darkest truth of all. The woman had been the one to pull the trigger. But the murder had been no crime of passion. It had been the culmination of a plan long in the making. The victim had learned something that would have brought her past to light, a past so horrifying that she had to silence him before he could expose her. The note, the supposed confession, was a lie, an elaborate cover-up designed to protect her. She had orchestrated everything from the beginning, manipulating those around her to believe that her husband had taken his own life. As Father Brown confronted her with the truth, she didn't flinch. She didn't deny it. Instead, she simply smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent a shudder down Father Brown's spine. "I had no choice," she whispered. "He would have ruined everything. He would have destroyed me. I did what was necessary. Father Brown stepped back, his heart racing. This wasn't just about a murder. This was something far deeper, a web of lies and manipulation that had been carefully constructed over the years. And as Father Brown stood there, the woman's chilling words reverberated in his mind. I did what was necessary. But as he prepared to bring her to justice, Father Brown found himself standing at a crossroads. This case had uncovered something in him that he hadn't known was there. The truth about the victim's wife had been shocking. But what Father Brown had learned about himself was far worse. He had spent his life seeking justice, but now he realized that justice in this case had a price. And that price wasn't just measured in lives, it was measured in something far more precious, his soul. It was as if the shadows of his own past had come rushing forward, and for the first time in his life, Father Brown wasn't sure he could face them. The truth had a way of tearing people apart, and now Father Brown found himself on the brink of losing everything. He had been the one to unearth the darkest of secrets, to expose the lies. But now the truth had come for him. He had been hiding something for years, something that, if revealed, would destroy everything he had worked for. As Father Brown stood in that room, the confession burning a hole in his soul, the weight of his own sins came crashing down on him. He had always been the one who solved the mysteries, who uncovered the secrets of others, but now it was his turn to face the truth. And the truth was something he wasn't sure he could survive. I've been lying to you all, Father Brown repeated, his voice shaking. But it wasn't just the case. It wasn't just the murder. He paused, taking a deep breath. I've been lying to myself. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. No one moved. No one spoke. Father Brown's words hung in the air like a dark cloud that threatened to engulf everything in its path. He couldn't continue. He couldn't expose the truth. Not yet. The first big reveal, the shocking confession that had turned everything upside down, was only the beginning. As Father Brown walked away from the case, he knew that the answers he had uncovered had only led to more questions. Who was he really? What had he done that could possibly be so dark, so damaging, that it threatened to unravel everything he had built? Father Brown's mind raced as he left the room, the weight of the truth bearing down on him. He had uncovered the darkest secrets of others, but now it was his own darkest secret that had come to light. The question that lingered in the air was no longer who the murderer was, but who Father Brown had become. The final twist, the one that no one saw coming, was still yet to be revealed. And as Father Brown walked away, his heart heavy with the knowledge of his own guilt, he knew that the truth, no matter how devastating, would never be told, not by him, not by anyone. I know who did it, Father Brown whispered, his voice barely audible in the silence. But the truth will never be told. And with those words, the mystery of Father Brown's darkest secret remained a riddle that no one could solve. Chapter 6. The killer Father Brown couldn't stop. The moment Father Brown entered the room, he knew it was too late. The killer was already gone, and no one, not even he, could stop what had already been set in motion. A woman lay lifeless on the floor, her blood pooling around her like a terrible omen. And on her desk lay a single, ominous note that made Father Brown's heart stop cold. "You can never save them all," it read, in handwriting he knew all too well. He had seen that hand before, on letters, on confessions, on pieces of paper that had once seemed so insignificant. But now, that handwriting was etched in his mind like a brand, a mark he couldn't erase. It was a message, a challenge, and a haunting reminder of a failure he could never outrun. Father Brown had always prided himself on his ability to solve mysteries, to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. But there was something about this case that twisted in his gut, a sense that he was not just facing an ordinary murderer, but something far darker, something he couldn't control. The woman, a well-known philanthropist, had been found dead in her study, her face twisted in a grimace of terror, as though she had known her end was coming. The circumstances pointed to a simple enough explanation: a robbery gone wrong or a personal vendetta. But Father Brown could see the bigger picture, a pattern emerging, one that had been hidden from everyone, even him. As Father Brown began his investigation, it became clear that the killer was no ordinary criminal. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that each death, each clue, was carefully orchestrated, as if someone was playing a cruel game, one where the stakes were higher than anyone could imagine. Each victim, each family member, and each seemingly unrelated piece of evidence only led him further into a labyrinth of deception and deceit. But as Father Brown dug deeper, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone was always one step ahead of him, manipulating the strings from the shadows. The victim's husband, a respected judge, seemed the most likely suspect at first. The two had been involved in a bitter dispute over the woman's charity work, which had begun to unravel. But as Father Brown examined the evidence more closely, he realized the judge couldn't have been the killer. His alibi checked out, and there was no sign of forced entry into the house. No, the killer wasn't a stranger. It was someone close to her, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. But who? As Father Brown delved deeper into the woman's personal life, he uncovered shocking secrets, affairs, financial troubles, and hidden enemies, things that made it increasingly difficult to determine who would have wanted her dead. Every answer only led to more questions. There were too many suspects, too many motives, and the deeper Father Brown went, the more it seemed like everyone had something to hide. His mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle, each revelation pulling him further from the truth. Then came the first big breakthrough. Father Brown discovered a secret ledger hidden in the victim's office, detailing a series of illegal transactions. The woman had been involved in something far darker than anyone had suspected. Her charity work had been a cover for a network of money laundering and corruption involving some of the most powerful people in the country. But the ledger wasn't just a list of names, it was a confession. The woman had been blackmailing these people, threatening to expose them unless they paid her off. The killer wasn't just someone seeking revenge, it was someone whose entire life had been at risk because of her actions. Father Brown was no longer just solving a murder. He was uncovering a conspiracy, one that reached into the highest echelons of society. But there was one name that kept coming up in the ledger, a name that sent a chill down Father Brown's spine. It was the name of someone he had known for years, someone he had trusted, someone who had been his ally. The killer was someone he had worked with, someone who had used their position to manipulate him, to control the investigation from behind the scenes. As Father Brown's mind raced, the full scope of the conspiracy began to unravel. The killer wasn't acting alone. They had been using him, feeding him false clues, pushing him in the wrong direction. The killer had orchestrated everything from the beginning, carefully pulling the strings to lead Father Brown to the wrong conclusions. But now that Father Brown had uncovered the truth, There was no going back. The killer was too powerful, too dangerous, and they knew that Father Brown had figured it out. The tension in the room was unbearable as Father Brown stood over the body, his mind racing. Who was the killer? And why had they chosen to play this twisted game with him? The answer came in a single, terrifying thought. The killer had been playing him all along. The game was never about finding the truth. It was about making Father Brown confront the darkest parts of his own soul. And now, the killer was gone, leaving Father Brown with nothing but a sense of crushing defeat. The first big reveal had been shocking, but it only raised more questions. Father Brown knew the killer's identity, but revealing it meant exposing the very people who had been manipulating him. It meant bringing down an entire network of corruption, one that would tear apart everything Father Brown had built. He had uncovered the truth, but the cost of exposing it was too high. Father Brown had always been a man of moral clarity, of unshakable conviction. But now he was faced with a choice he could never have anticipated. Did he expose the truth and bring down the killer, knowing it would destroy countless lives in the process? Or did he stay silent, allowing the darkness to continue, knowing that the killer would never stop, that the conspiracy would keep growing? The room seemed to close in on Father Brown as he stood in the stillness, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like an unshakable burden. He had been so sure, so confident in his ability to solve any mystery. But this one was different. This one had shattered his understanding of justice, of right and wrong. The darkness that had once seemed so far away was now right in front of him, staring him in the face. Father Brown turned and walked away from the body, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. He knew the truth, but he also knew that some truths were too dangerous to be exposed. He had uncovered the killer, but in doing so, he had uncovered something far worse. The reality that even the greatest of detectives could be played, that even he could be manipulated by forces beyond his control. The game had been rigged from the start, and Father Brown had been a pawn all along. As he left the house, the rain began to fall, each drop a reminder of the choices he had made, of the paths he had walked down that could never be undone. The killer may have escaped, but the true cost of the mystery was far greater than he could have ever imagined. Father Brown knew who did it, but revealing the truth would destroy everything. And so he walked away, knowing that the killer was out there, still free, still manipulating the world around him. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered to himself as he disappeared into the night, the weight of the truth heavy on his shoulders. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 7. Father Brown's shocking discovery unfolds. The moment Father Brown opened the door, the air in the room turned cold, colder than the winter frost outside. The man standing before him wasn't the killer. He was something far worse. "I've been hiding a truth that will destroy everything," the man said, his voice trembling with fear and guilt. "And you're the only one who can stop it from getting worse." Father Brown's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing. The case had spiraled out of control in a way he had never anticipated. And now, standing at the threshold of a dark truth, Father Brown realized that he was no longer chasing the killer. He was chasing a secret so dangerous that even he might not survive it. The case had begun simply enough. A local business tycoon was found dead in his office, a single gunshot wound to the chest, and no sign of forced entry. His expensive watch was still on his wrist, his briefcase untouched, and everything in the wire office was just as it had been the night before. But as Father Brown began his investigation, the first hint of something strange appeared: a missing ledger. The victim had been involved in several high-profile transactions, and this ledger, which contained the details of some shady dealings, was nowhere to be found. The police were quick to rule it as a robbery gone wrong, but Father Brown knew better. There was something far more intricate, far more dangerous, hidden beneath the surface. As Father Brown dug deeper into the life of the victim, he discovered a tangled web of lies, betrayals, and dark secrets. The business tycoon had been involved in numerous shady deals, but none of them seemed to be the motive for his murder. Everyone around him, the wife, the business partners, the employees, had a reason to want him dead, but none of them had a clear motive. Each suspect seemed to be hiding something, and the more Father Brown uncovered, the more it seemed like the victim had been a man with too many enemies, too many threats to ignore. The breakthrough came when Father Brown discovered a hidden compartment in the victim's desk. Inside it, he found a series of letters, written in a hand that seemed oddly familiar. The letters were cryptic, but they painted a disturbing picture. Someone was blackmailing the victim, threatening to expose his darkest secrets unless he complied with their demands. But what were these secrets, and who was behind the blackmail? Father Brown's investigation took him to a place he had never expected. The victim's closest confidant, a man who had been with him for years, his right-hand man. The man had always seemed trustworthy, reliable, but as Father Brown pressed him for information, he began to unravel. The man's guilt was written all over his face. It was clear that he had been involved in something far darker than anyone could have imagined. But as Father Brown pushed him for answers, the man finally broke. "I know who killed him," the man confessed, his voice barely audible, "but I didn't do it. I couldn't. He wasn't the man he seemed to be. There's something you don't understand, something that no one does." His eyes darted around nervously, as though he feared someone might be listening. "You need to understand this, Father Brown. This is bigger than you think. I was a part of something that I can never undo. And now, you're involved too." Father Brown's mind raced as he tried to piece together the man's confession. What was he talking about? What was this something that was bigger than everything else? The more Father Brown asked, the more the man seemed to shrink into himself, his guilt overwhelming him. But before he could say anything more, the man collapsed, clutching his chest. His last words were a mere whisper. "It's too late. You're too late." The man died in Father Brown's arms, leaving behind more questions than answers. What had he meant by "it's too late"? What was the secret he had been hiding? And who had the power to control him so completely? The more Father Brown thought about it, the more he realized that he was caught in the middle of something far bigger than a simple murder investigation. He was facing a conspiracy that reached further than he had ever imagined, one that involved powerful figures who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. As Father Brown searched for answers, he began to uncover pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. The business tycoon had been involved in illegal activities, yes, but he had also been helping to expose a larger criminal syndicate. The blackmail, the letters, and the threats weren't just about money or power. They were about silencing someone who had knowledge of the syndicate's operations. The man had been murdered not because of his own crimes, but because he had been a threat to something much more dangerous. But there was a twist. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more it seemed like the victim hadn't been murdered by a hired gun or a vengeful partner. No, the killer was someone close to him, someone he had trusted. And the killer's motive wasn't just greed. It was something far more personal, a betrayal that ran deeper than Father Brown had anticipated. As Father Brown stood at the edge of the revelation, the killer's identity was right there in front of him, staring him in the face. But it wasn't just the killer who had been hiding secrets. It was Father Brown himself. He had been blind to the truth all along. The first big reveal came when Father Brown uncovered a hidden file in the victim's office, one that contained a series of photographs that linked the business tycoon to some of the most powerful figures in the country. But these photographs weren't just of meetings or business dealings. They were of someone Father Brown had known for years, someone he had trusted completely. The victim's confidant, the one who had confessed to knowing the killer, was in these photographs, standing alongside the most influential figures in the syndicate. And then there was Father Brown. He was in some of the photographs too, though his presence was subtle, hidden in the background. But it was there, and it was a truth Father Brown couldn't ignore. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, Father Brown realized that the killer was not just someone he had known. It was someone who had been controlling the investigation from the start. The blackmail, the threats, the death, they were all part of a much larger game, one where Father Brown had been a pawn. His investigation, his pursuit of justice, had been manipulated from the very beginning, and now, as the truth began to unfold, Father Brown could feel the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on him. But there was something even more terrifying, lurking in the shadows. The killer, the one Father Brown had been chasing, was not just trying to cover up a murder. They were trying to silence the only person who knew the full extent of the conspiracy. And now, Father Brown had become the target. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that there was no escaping the dark forces that had been controlling everything. He had uncovered the truth, but the truth came with a price, one that Father Brown was not sure he was willing to pay. As Father Brown stood in the middle of the victim's office, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him, he knew that he had uncovered something far more dangerous than a simple murder. He had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened everything he believed in, everything he had worked for. And now, with his own life at risk, Father Brown was left with one final question. Could he stop the killer before it was too late? Or had he already been played into the hands of someone far more powerful than he could ever have imagined? The tension in the air was unbearable as Father Brown prepared to make his final move. But just as he was about to act, the door opened behind him, and the killer stepped into the room, their face hidden in the shadows. Father Brown's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to face them, the truth dawning on him too late. "I know who did it," Father Brown said, his voice a whisper in the dark. "But the truth will never be told." And with that, the mystery remained unsolved, a riddle too dangerous to answer. Chapter 8. The Sinister Crime. Father Brown solves. The moment I walked into that room, I knew that this wasn't just another murder, Father Brown said, his voice hoarse with a mix of disbelief and horror. This one, it was personal. His words hung in the air, chilling the room to its core. The body before him, cold, lifeless, and cruelly positioned, was a puzzle too sinister for even his sharpest instincts to comprehend at first. It wasn't just a crime, it was a message. And the message was one that Father Brown had never expected to hear. As he looked at the victim, The heavy weight of dread settled over him like a suffocating fog. The crime was far from random, and even darker forces were pulling the strings. The victim, a well-respected family patriarch, was discovered in his study, a single knife plunged deep into his chest. At first glance, it seemed like a straightforward case, a robbery gone wrong, or perhaps an angry family dispute that escalated into violence. But Father Brown had learned long ago that things were rarely as simple as they appeared. The room had been ransacked, but nothing of value was missing, and the victim's personal effects were undisturbed. No one had heard the struggle, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest how or why the man had died. A murder in cold blood, with no obvious motive. Father Brown's mind was already racing as he examined the crime scene, every clue painting a darker picture. There was something about the way the body was positioned, face down, as though the killer had intentionally made it look like the man had fallen in a struggle. But the placement of the knife, the way the blood had pooled, it wasn't right. The killer had been meticulous, too precise. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a planned execution. But who would want this man dead? And why go to such lengths to hide the truth? As Father Brown began to investigate, he quickly discovered that the victim, while beloved by the community, had a dark side that no one talked about. Hidden away in a safe in the study, Father Brown uncovered records, documents detailing large sums of money funneled through various shady businesses, connections to corrupt politicians, and the murky dealings that no one in the family would dare speak of. The family members, who had initially seemed so devastated by the loss of their patriarch, were now looking more and more like potential suspects. But Father Brown wasn't so easily swayed. There was something else at play here, something far deeper than greed or personal vendettas. The deeper Father Brown dug, the more he realized that the victim's family was filled with lies and secrets. The widow, though outwardly mournful, had a coldness to her that made Father Brown uneasy. Her daughter, so quiet and reserved, seemed more interested in the inheritance than in the loss of her father. And then there was the son, a man with a temper and a history of violence. Each one had a reason to want the patriarch dead, but none of them had the clear motive that Father Brown was looking for. Father Brown spent hours speaking with each of the family members, but their alibis were airtight, their stories unconvincing. They each seemed to be hiding something, but they wouldn't break. It was the silence, the way they avoided his gaze when asked certain questions, that made Father Brown's skin crawl. It was as if they knew more than they were, letting on as if they had orchestrated something terrible and were trying to cover their tracks. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Father Brown, combing through the victim's correspondence, found a letter buried deep in the desk drawer. It was a letter addressed to the victim's brother, a man who had been estranged from the family for years. The letter spoke of an impending confrontation, a threat to expose the victim's deepest secrets unless he paid a heavy price. The man was being blackmailed, but by whom? And why was the victim's brother being dragged back into this web of deceit? Father Brown's instincts told him that the answers were hidden somewhere in this family's history. The tension had been building, the layers of the mystery pulling tighter around him with every passing moment. The more he uncovered, the more everything pointed to one dark truth. The murder wasn't about money or power. It was about revenge. Revenge for something the victim had done years ago, something that had been buried so deep that no one in the family dared speak of it. The key to the mystery wasn't in the present, it was in the past. Father Brown's investigation led him to a shocking discovery. The victim's brother wasn't just a blackmail victim. He was also a murderer. Years ago, when they were both younger, the victim and his brother had been involved in a violent incident. The victim had framed his brother for a crime he didn't commit, pushing him into exile and destroying his life. The truth about the incident had been hidden, sealed away by the family, in an attempt to protect their reputation. But now, all those years of bitterness, all that hatred had bubbled to the surface in a way no one had expected. The first big reveal came when Father Brown confronted the victim's brother. The man, now living in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, had always been thought of as a recluse, a man who had nothing to do with the family's affairs. But as Father Brown pressed him for answers, the truth spilled out like a flood. The brother had returned, not for money, not for revenge on the family, but to confront his brother one last time. He had wanted the truth to be known, to be acknowledged. But when he arrived at the family estate, he found that his brother was already dead. It was clear that the victim's family had tried to cover up his death, to spin a story that would protect their reputation. But the truth was undeniable. The murder was a long overdue act of justice, a way for the victim's brother to get back at him for all the years of torment and betrayal. But just as Father Brown thought he had solved the case, something shifted. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that there was another layer to the mystery that no one had anticipated. The widow, the daughter, and the son had all been involved in the cover-up, each playing their part in ensuring that the truth about the family's dark past remained hidden. But there was something else, something Father Brown had missed until now. The true killer wasn't the victim's brother, nor was it one of the family members. It was someone who had been watching from the shadows, someone who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The family had been living in fear of the truth being exposed, but they had never realized that someone had been orchestrating everything from the very beginning. The killer had manipulated Father Brown into discovering the truth, but the truth wasn't the whole story. The killer had been pulling the strings all along, ensuring that everything unfolded exactly as they had planned. Father Brown's heart pounded in his chest as he finally understood what had been happening. The family, the murder, the conspiracy. It was all part of a larger game, a game that Father Brown had been unknowingly playing for weeks. And now, with the truth finally uncovered, Father Brown was faced with a new, terrifying reality. The killer was still out there, still watching, still waiting for their next move. "I know who did it," Father Brown said quietly, his voice thick with realization. "But the truth will never be told." With those words, the mystery was left unsolved, the secrets of the past buried deep beneath the surface. The killer had won. The truth would never come to light. As Father Brown left the family estate, he could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him. The crime had been solved, but the cost of uncovering the truth had been far greater than he had ever imagined. The killer was free, and Father Brown was left with nothing but the knowledge that sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones that can never be solved. Chapter 9. Father Brown, Unraveling a Deadly Mystery. The moment Father Brown stepped into the dimly lit room, he knew this case would haunt him for the rest of his life. The words he spoke were chilling in their simplicity, and yet they carried the weight of an unbearable truth. He looked around at the faces of the people who had gathered in this ancient manor, each one now trembling with the fear of what he might say next. "The killer is here among us," Father Brown announced, his voice steady, but beneath it, a subtle tremor of unease. "But I fear the greatest threat has not yet been revealed." The room seemed to freeze, and for a long, unbearable moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. Father Brown knew that he had uncovered the threads of a conspiracy so dark, so twisted, that even he wasn't certain whether he could untangle it. It all started with a peculiar case. A wealthy and influential lord was found dead under bizarre circumstances. The police had dismissed it as an accidental death, perhaps a stroke or a natural cause. But something about the way the man's body had been discovered left Father Brown unconvinced. The Lord's death was clean, too clean. No signs of violence, no struggle, no indication that anything had been amiss until the body was found hours later. Yet there was something in the way the room had been arranged, in the way the curtains had been drawn just so, that made Father Brown suspicious. The Lord's servants had been unusually tight-lipped. The family, although devastated by the death, seemed to hide something in their eyes, an unease that spoke of a truth they had no intention of revealing. Father Brown had spent hours questioning them, and each person's answer seemed rehearsed, too perfect, too guarded. He had learned that the Lord had recently received a letter from an old associate, a man thought to be dead. A letter that carried within it a cryptic warning, a warning that the Lord had not taken seriously, it seemed, or so it appeared. As Father Brown delved deeper into the investigation, he began to notice odd details that made the mystery more complex than he could have ever imagined. The Lord's finances were meticulously kept, but a close look revealed transactions that didn't add up. Funds were being funneled into accounts that didn't make sense. What was even more puzzling was the absence of any evidence of a will. Despite his fortune, the Lord had, apparently, died intestate, leaving behind a family eager to inherit his wealth, but seemingly unprepared for the reality of his death. The first major breakthrough came when Father Brown discovered a hidden drawer in the Lord's study, a drawer that contained a stack of letters and documents. Among them was a single piece of paper that stood out, a letter unsigned, but bearing the seal of a man whom Father Brown had once investigated years ago. The letter spoke of a debt owed, a life taken, and a reckoning that would be settled. There were no specifics, just cryptic language, but one sentence stood out like a red flag. "The price will be paid in full, whether by the hand of fate or a more direct method." Father Brown felt a chill settle in his spine. This was no ordinary death. This was a message, a debt that had been called in. But who was the sender? And why now? As Father Brown continued his search, the pieces of the puzzle grew more scattered and elusive. The servants were questioned again, but this time, one of them, a maid, let slip a detail she hadn't before. She had seen the Lord's nephew sneaking around the manor the night of his uncle's death. The nephew, a young man who had recently returned from abroad, had been spending more and more time with his uncle, and rumors suggested that the two were involved in heated discussions about the family's fortune. Was the nephew involved? Did he have something to do with the mysterious death? The more Father Brown thought about it, the more it seemed plausible, but something didn't sit right with him. The timing was too perfect, the clues too staged. Father Brown's suspicions grew as he uncovered a deeply buried truth. The Lord's nephew wasn't just a mere beneficiary of the fortune. He had been working with someone else, someone with more power than anyone had realized. It was as if the entire family was wrapped in a web of lies and manipulation, and every attempt to get closer to the truth was met with resistance. But Father Brown had a knack for uncovering the darkest secrets, and with every step, the danger increased. It wasn't until Father Brown spoke with the Lord's eldest daughter that the truth began to truly unravel. She was a woman of immense beauty and grace, but there was something behind her calm facade, something that Father Brown couldn't put his finger on. In their conversation, she revealed a shocking piece of information. The Lord had been involved in a dangerous game, one where power, money, and manipulation were all in play. He had made enemies over the years, but none of them had been as dangerous as the one lurking in the shadows. The family had been involved in a financial scandal, one so deeply rooted in corruption that it could destroy them all. But the worst part of it was that the Lord had been trying to make things right, trying to pay off his debts, clean up his past, before it was too late. But what Father Brown discovered next shook him to his core. The Lord's death had not been an accident. It wasn't just the result of a hidden ailment or a random stroke. The Lord had been murdered, but by whom? And why? As Father Brown sifted through the evidence, he stumbled upon a clue that turned everything on its head. The Lord's death wasn't a random act of violence. It was a calculated move, a plan set into motion long before Father Brown had arrived on the scene. The murderer had been manipulating everyone, including Father Brown himself, using the web of lies and deceit to create a perfect illusion. The first big reveal came when Father Brown discovered the truth about the victim's nephew. The young man had been involved in a deadly conspiracy, one that connected the family to a network of criminals with far-reaching influence. He had been the one pulling the strings all along, orchestrating the murder, and setting up the perfect cover-up. But the nephew wasn't acting alone. He had been working with someone far more dangerous, someone Father Brown had never suspected. The Lord's eldest daughter, the woman who had seemed so poised, so innocent, had been the mastermind behind it all. Father Brown's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the chaos that was unfolding. The daughter had orchestrated the entire plan, using her influence over her family to set the stage for her own gain. The Lord's murder was merely a means to an end. She had been the one pulling the strings, from the shadows, manipulating everyone to her will. And now, as the truth came to light, Father Brown was left with one terrifying question. How had he missed it all? How had he been so blind to the woman's true nature? But just as Father Brown began to make sense of the tangled mess, another twist emerged. The daughter, the nephew, and the family. They were all connected to a much larger conspiracy, one that stretched beyond the walls of the manor, beyond the reach of Father Brown's investigation. The truth wasn't just about a murder. It was about something far more sinister. Someone was orchestrating events from the shadows, someone who had been manipulating the entire family, controlling their every move, and using Father Brown as a pawn in a deadly game. Father Brown's heart pounded as he realized that he was in over his head. The mystery was no longer just about finding the killer. It was about surviving the truth. With each passing moment, the danger grew more real, more immediate. Father Brown had unraveled a deadly web of lies, but the truth had come at a cost. The killer was still out there, still watching, and Father Brown had no idea who could be trusted anymore. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered, his voice filled with a mix of anger and regret. But the truth will never be told. With that, the room fell silent, the weight of the revelation too much to bear. Father Brown knew that sometimes the answers we seek are more dangerous than the mysteries themselves. And as he walked away from the manor, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case, this deadly mystery, had changed him forever. Chapter 10. The Murder That Nearly Destroyed Father Brown. "I've never been this close to the edge before," Father Brown muttered, staring down at the lifeless body in front of him. His fingers trembled as he reached out to touch the cold, motionless hand of the victim. "And I don't know if I can pull back." His words were as much an admission of his own fear as they were an acknowledgement of the monstrous truth he had uncovered. For the first time in his career, Father Brown wasn't just solving a crime. He was being swallowed whole by it. The murder he was investigating wasn't just any murder. It was one that tore through the very fabric of everything he stood for, a crime so vile and personal that it threatened to destroy him. The victim was a close friend, someone Father Brown had known for years. Father Roger, the parish priest in a nearby town. A man of faith, integrity, and, to Father Brown, a kindred spirit. They had shared many a conversation about morality, faith, and the mysteries of the human soul. Father Brown had never expected to find him dead. Not like this. The sight was enough to make him feel like he was falling into a dark abyss, unable to climb out. The man's body was lying on the floor of his study, his face twisted in terror, as though he had seen something that shattered the very core of his belief. At first, the case seemed simple. A robbery gone wrong. The office had been ransacked, papers scattered across the floor, drawers overturned. The scene screamed chaos, desperation. But the truth was far more disturbing. Nothing of value had been stolen. The murderer had only taken one thing, the life of Father Roger. And the deeper Father Brown looked, the more he realized this was no random act. There was something far darker at play here, something that went beyond the violence of the crime. This wasn't just a murder, it was an execution. The investigation quickly spiraled out of control as Father Brown's suspicions grew. What had Father Roger been hiding? The more he uncovered about the priest's life, the more it seemed that Father Roger wasn't the man Father Brown thought he knew. It wasn't the life of a humble, pious man. It was a life entangled in lies, secrets, and the very sins he had spent years trying to atone for. Father Brown found hidden journals, letters between Father Roger and a mysterious figure, letters that spoke of debts owed and threats made. Each word in those letters chilled Father Brown to his very core. There was no mention of redemption, no talk of salvation, only of desperation and fear. As Father Brown continued his investigation, he spoke to those who had been closest to Father Roger, his parishioners, his fellow clergy, the people who had known him for decades. Each one had a different story to tell, but there was something about them that didn't sit right. No one wanted to talk about the years before Father Roger had come to the town. It was as if a dark shadow had been cast over that period of his life. People looked at Father Brown with unease, as though they were terrified to say anything that might open the door to a truth they weren't ready to face. But Father Brown pressed on, digging deeper into the man's past, determined to uncover the full extent of the secret that had driven someone to murder him. The tension built steadily, each clue leading Father Brown further into a maze of deception and terror. It wasn't until he uncovered a hidden room in the back of the church, an old, forgotten space, that the mystery took a turn Father Brown hadn't expected. Inside the room, there were more letters, more documents, and at the center of it all, a single, blood-stained book. Father Brown opened it slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The pages were filled with confessions, but not of sins as Father Roger had once preached. These were confessions of something far more monstrous. Deals made with figures from the criminal underworld, blackmail, and the manipulation of people's lives for financial gain. Father Roger had been hiding something much worse than anyone had ever known. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Father Brown realized the horrifying truth. Father Roger had been part of a vast criminal enterprise, using his position as a man of the cloth to control and exploit the vulnerable. He had been involved in money laundering, extortion, and a host of other illegal activities. But more than that, he had been the mastermind behind a web of secrets that involved some of the most powerful people in the country. The priest's kindness, his humility, his apparent devotion to God, it had all been a mask, a carefully constructed facade to hide the dark deeds he had been committing in the shadows. But just as Father Brown was beginning to understand the full extent of the corruption, the mystery took another, more chilling twist. The person responsible for Father Roger's death wasn't one of the criminals Father Roger had been dealing with. It was someone much closer to Father Brown, someone he had never suspected. The murderer wasn't a stranger. It was someone from within the church, someone who had been right under his nose all along. The first big reveal came when Father Brown discovered the identity of the killer, a fellow priest who had been working with Father Roger, a man named Father Thomas. Father Thomas had been a trusted ally, a friend who had shared Father Brown's passion for justice and truth. But now, Father Brown was faced with the shocking realization that Father Thomas had been part of the same criminal operation. Not only had he known about Father Roger's activities, but he had also been helping him. And when Father Roger had begun to back out of the operation to try to atone for his sins, Father Thomas had decided that he couldn't let him leave. Father Roger had been a threat to their entire operation. He was going to expose everything. And so, Father Thomas had killed him to protect himself, to protect the empire they had built. Father Brown could hardly believe it. Father Thomas, the man he had shared his deepest thoughts with, the one who had helped him on so many cases, he was the killer. And yet, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Father Brown realized that he had known the truth all along. There had always been something about Father Thomas's behavior, something that never quite added up. The way he had been too eager to help, too quick to offer advice. He had been hiding his true nature behind a mask of piety. Father Brown had trusted him, and now that trust had been shattered, leaving him with nothing but the cold, painful reality that the one person he had believed in had turned out to be the very thing he had always fought against. But the true horror came when Father Brown tried to confront Father Thomas. The confrontation was violent, a struggle between two men who had once been on the same side. Father Thomas, with desperation in his eyes, tried to flee, but Father Brown caught up with him just outside the church. The confession came in a whisper, barely audible, but it was enough to shatter everything Father Brown thought he knew. Father Thomas didn't just kill Father Roger out of fear. He killed him because he had no other choice. He had been under the control of something darker, something more powerful. And now, with Father Brown closing in, the secret was too dangerous to keep. "You don't understand," Father Thomas said, his voice breaking. I never wanted this, but I couldn't get out. I couldn't escape. And now, it's too late." Father Brown stood over the broken man, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The killer was caught, but the victory felt hollow. The truth had come to light, but it had come at the cost of everything Father Brown had believed in. The man he had trusted, the friend he had relied on, was a murderer. And now, the church, the very institution he had devoted his life to, was stained with the blood of those who had corrupted it. As Father Brown walked away from the scene, his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and regret. The case was over, but the scars it had left behind would never heal. And as he whispered to himself, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told," Father Brown realized that some mysteries were too dark to fully comprehend, and some truths were too dangerous to reveal. The cost of knowledge was too high, and Father Brown had paid the ultimate price. The truth had been uncovered, but at what cost? And now, with everything lost, Father Brown was left with nothing but the knowledge that sometimes even the greatest detective could be consumed by the darkness he sought to expose. Chapter 11. Father Brown's Dangerous Game of Deceit. "They wanted me to kill him," Father Brown whispered, his voice barely a tremor against the silence of the room. His words hit the air like a bullet, breaking through the stillness with such force that the room seemed to collapse in on itself. His eyes, usually calm and composed, now held a darkness that sent a shiver down the spine of anyone who dared look into them. For the first time, Father Brown wasn't the detective, the calm observer, the trusted man of faith. He was a player in a deadly game, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. But the worst part of it was this: the people behind the plot weren't strangers. They were people he knew, people he trusted. It all began with the disappearance of a man no one cared to look for, a writer, obscure, eccentric, yet known for his controversial works that had made him the subject of ridicule and praise in equal measure. His name had been whispered in literary circles, but no one had thought much of his absence. When the man's body was discovered, it was Father Brown who was called to investigate, and what he found made his blood run cold. The man had been murdered, and the circumstances were bizarre, to say the least. The body was discovered in a quiet village near the outskirts of town, hidden away in the ruins of an old church, a place the victim had visited often in his strange, solitary walks. At first, the clues were sparse. No signs of a struggle, no obvious wounds, but there was something wrong with the body, a subtle detail that Father Brown, with his trained eye, could not ignore. The writer's expression was one of sheer terror, his eyes wide open, as though he had died in horror. But the strangest thing was the way the body had been arranged. It was as if the killer had placed the man in that church, in that exact spot, for a purpose. Father Brown couldn't explain why, but something deep within told him that this murder wasn't random, it was deliberate, and it was personal. Father Brown's investigation soon led him to a tangled web of deceit, one where every person he questioned seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle, but no one seemed to have the full picture. The writer's acquaintances, his colleagues, and even his own family were all potential suspects, but none of their stories added up. The victim had been working on a novel, one that was said to contain a deeply personal revelation, a secret that, if exposed, could ruin the lives of those around him. Was this the motive? Was the murder committed to silence the writer's explosive truth? As Father Brown pieced together the fragments of the writer's life, he uncovered the shocking truth. The writer's secret wasn't just a scandal, it was a lie so profound that the writer had been blackmailing his closest associates for years. But what was the lie, and who had the most to gain from keeping it hidden? The deeper Father Brown delved, the more he realized that the writer's death wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning. He was being pulled into a game far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced before. The suspense continued to build as Father Brown uncovered more disturbing details. The writer's most recent manuscript had gone missing. His house had been searched, his personal effects rifled through, but there was no sign of the manuscript. Someone had taken it, and they were willing to kill to keep it out of the public eye. But who? Father Brown's suspicions grew as he analyzed the writer's inner circle. There were many with motives. The writer's estranged wife, whose marriage had been fraught with betrayal, the ambitious young protégé who stood to gain everything if the manuscript were destroyed, the writer's editor who had been desperately trying to convince him to abandon his work, claiming it would ruin his career. The possibilities were endless. Father Brown knew that the answers were hidden somewhere among these people. But the more he questioned them, the more he realized they were all playing a dangerous game of their own, one where lies and manipulation were the currency. No one was telling the truth, and everyone had something to hide. But it wasn't until Father Brown spoke to one final person that the true depth of the mystery began to unfold. The writer's closest friend, a man who had been the writer's confidant for years, admitted something that made Father Brown's blood run cold. The writer had been involved in a secret society, one that dealt in forbidden knowledge and dark secrets, a society that would stop at nothing to protect its power. The manuscript, the one that had caused so much turmoil, contained more than just the writer's thoughts on literature. It held the key to exposing the society's darkest secrets. But just when Father Brown thought he was getting closer to the truth, another twist emerged, one so shocking, so mind-bending, that it turned everything on its head. The writer's death hadn't been a random act. It had been orchestrated, but not by the people Father Brown had suspected. The murderer, the one who had set the entire deadly game in motion, wasn't anyone Father Brown had ever considered. It was someone he had trusted, someone who had been playing him from the very beginning. The first big reveal came when Father Brown confronted the writer's closest confidant, the man who had seemed so genuinely concerned, so involved in the investigation. The man's face, once calm and composed, twisted into something darker as Father Brown pushed him for answers. "You've been playing a dangerous game," Father Brown said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Haven't you?" The man's eyes widened in shock, but then they hardened, his expression shifting into one of cold calculation. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew too much. The writer had to die. He was going to expose us all. Father Brown was stunned. The truth had been right in front of him all along, buried beneath layers of deceit and manipulation. The writer's death hadn't been the result of a random act of violence. It had been planned, orchestrated by someone who had been hiding in plain sight. The writer's confidant, the man who had seemed so trustworthy, had been the mastermind behind the murder. But why? Why would he kill someone he had been so close to? The man's confession sent shockwaves through Father Brown. It was for the society, the man continued, his voice cracking. He was going to expose us all. Our secrets, our power. It was all at risk. I had to do it to protect everything we've built. The society is too dangerous to fail. The writer knew too much, and we couldn't let him expose us. Not now, not ever. Father Brown could hardly believe what he was hearing. The writer's murder wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a calculated move, a sacrifice made to protect something far greater, something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The society the writer had been involved in wasn't just a group of intellectuals. It was a secret, shadowy organization, one that dealt in manipulation, power, and control. And now, Father Brown had been pulled into their deadly game. The suspense reached its peak as Father Brown realized that he had become a pawn in this dangerous game of deceit. The killer was no longer just a figure he was chasing. He was part of the web, and he didn't even know how deep it went. The mystery was far from solved, and the killer was still out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. As Father Brown stood there, contemplating the dark truth that had been revealed to him, he knew that the game wasn't over. It had only just begun. "I know who did it," Father Brown said, his voice low and filled with resolve. "But the truth will never be told." And with that, the game continued, more dangerous than ever, and Father Brown knew that there was no escaping the deadly web of deceit that had entangled him. As he walked away, the question remained: could Father Brown survive the dangerous game he had been thrust into? Or would the truth, as it so often did, destroy him in the end? Chapter 12. The Confession That Changed Everything Forever. "You've been chasing the wrong person all along, Father," the voice echoed in the dimly lit room, sending a cold shiver down Father Brown's spine. He turned slowly, every instinct screaming that something monumental, something terrifying, was about to unfold. The person standing before him was someone he had known for years, someone he had trusted, someone whose face now held a look of finality, a look of someone who had been hiding something far darker than Father Brown could ever have imagined. "I killed him," they continued, their voice steady, their words cutting through the air like a knife. But it wasn't just murder. It was something far worse. Father Brown's mind raced. For weeks, he had been investigating the brutal murder of a prominent politician, a man who had used his power to control and manipulate everyone around him. The case had drawn Father Brown into a web of deceit, lies, and twisted motives, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. The killer, someone he had believed to be innocent, now stood before him with an unsettling calmness, confessing to a crime that no one had expected. The shock, the sheer weight of the words, left Father Brown standing motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. He was no longer the calm detective, the patient observer. Now he was face to face with a dark truth that would forever change the course of his life. The case had begun as a typical political murder, but as Father Brown delved deeper, it quickly became apparent that there was more at play than anyone had suspected. The politician had been known for his ruthlessness, for his ability to destroy anyone who stood in his way. But what was the true motive behind his murder? Was it a personal vendetta, a political rivalry, or something even more sinister? The deeper Father Brown dug, the more twisted and complicated the case became. Father Brown had spoken to dozens of people, family members, colleagues, enemies, but every clue seemed to lead to a dead end. The politician's wife had an alibi, his children were too afraid to speak up, and his closest allies seemed to be hiding their own secrets. But Father Brown didn't give up. He knew there was something more, something hidden in the shadows. The killer was out there, and Father Brown was determined to find them. But what he hadn't anticipated was that the confession would come from the last person he ever suspected. It wasn't until Father Brown returned to the politician's mansion, alone, that the truth began to reveal itself. The mansion, once full of life and power, now felt empty and oppressive. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, holding their secrets tightly. Father Brown had been over every inch of the house, questioning everyone. But it wasn't until he ventured into the politician's private study that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The study was just as it had always been, neatly organized, filled with books, papers, and expensive furnishings. But one thing was different. On the desk, barely visible in the corner, was a letter. It had been left there, carelessly, as if someone had intended to return to it, but never had. Father Brown picked it up, his fingers brushing against the paper. The letter was addressed to the politician's wife, but it was filled with threats, cryptic warnings about betrayal, about secrets that were about to be exposed. It wasn't a letter from a lover, nor was it a plea for help. It was something far more sinister, a confession of guilt. As Father Brown read the letter, his thoughts began to spiral. The politician had been blackmailing people, manipulating them to do his bidding. But this letter spoke of something far more dangerous. The writer was not simply confessing to a crime, they were confessing to a lifetime of lies, to a life lived in the shadows of corruption and deceit. It was a confession that came too late, a confession that was meant to be buried forever. Father Brown couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This letter didn't match the story he had been told. The pieces didn't fit. And then it hit him. What if the letter wasn't written by the politician at all? What if it was written by someone else, someone close to him, someone who had been hiding in plain sight, using their proximity to the victim to manipulate the entire situation? That's when the truth hit Father Brown like a freight train. The confession, the one that had changed everything forever, was not a random admission from a stranger. It was a confession from someone who had been controlling everything all along. The murderer was not someone on the outside looking in. The murderer was inside, manipulating everyone, pulling the strings from the shadows. And the killer's identity wasn't just a revelation. It was a devastating blow to everything Father Brown had believed. Father Brown confronted the person who had been behind the murder, the one who had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. They weren't just a person caught in a web of circumstance. They were a master manipulator, someone who had used Father Brown's own sense of justice against him. As the killer revealed the details of the crime, the intricate plans, and the motives that had driven them to commit the murder, Father Brown's world began to shatter. The killer confessed not out of remorse, but out of a twisted sense of triumph. They had used Father Brown's own investigation to further their own goals, knowing that the detective's relentless pursuit of truth would lead him right to them. The politician's death wasn't a simple murder. It was a carefully planned act, one designed to expose the hidden truths that had been buried for so long. And now, the killer was standing in front of Father Brown, revealing it all, watching as the detective struggled to piece together the final truth. "I killed him," the killer repeated, their voice steady, cold. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about freedom. Freedom from the lies we've all been living. Freedom from the darkness that has controlled us for so long. Their eyes gleamed with something Father Brown couldn't quite place, something that both terrified and fascinated him. I killed him, Father, but I did it for all of us, for the future. Father Brown stood frozen, his mind struggling to make sense of the words. The confession had shattered everything. The truth had been right in front of him, yet he had never seen it. The killer, the person who had been orchestrating the murder, was someone he had trusted, someone he had been working alongside for weeks. And now, that trust had been completely destroyed. The first big reveal had been enough to send Father Brown reeling, but the true horror came when the killer explained how deep the deception had gone. The politician's death had been part of a much larger plan, one that involved people Father Brown had known for years. The killer was just a pawn in a much greater game, a game that had been set in motion long before Father Brown had ever stepped into the picture. As Father Brown listened, he began to realize that the consequences of this murder were far-reaching, beyond anything he had ever imagined. The killer's motivations weren't just personal. They were political, societal, and far more dangerous than anything Father Brown had ever encountered. The web of deceit was far larger, far more intricate than he could have ever anticipated. The cliffhanger came when Father Brown was faced with a choice. Could he expose the truth, knowing it would tear apart the lives of everyone involved, or could he let the killer walk free, knowing that the world would never truly know what had happened? As the killer smirked, waiting for Father Brown's decision, the detective was left with one final question. Was this really a game of justice, or was it a game of manipulation, one where the real players were still hidden in the shadows? Father Brown stood there, silent for a moment, before speaking his final words. "I know who did it," he said quietly, his voice full of sorrow. "But the truth will never be told." And with that, the killer disappeared into the darkness, leaving Father Brown to face the consequences of his own choices. The mystery was solved, but the cost of that solution was far greater than Father Brown had ever imagined. As he walked away from the case, he couldn't help but wonder if the truth was something that no one was ever meant to know. And if it was, then perhaps it was better left buried.